task validation framework in Dynamics 365 supply chain management. My name is Alejandra Cabrales and I will be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events. Karen, over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Alejandra. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Hiren Nayak. I'm a Senior Fast Track Solution Architect in Dynamics 365 Fast Track team. Joining me today to co-present, Ajay Singh, who is a Principal Fast Track Solution Architect within the Fast Track team. And we also have Leonard Conrad, who is a Principal Engineering Manager from the Dynamics 365 product team. This is going to be two parts Tech Talk series. Today, we are going to cover the first part about the warehouse app task validation framework. In the next Tech Talk, we will deep dive into the performance testing using JMeter and the warehouse app task validation framework. In today's Tech Talk, we will cover what is warehouse app task validation framework, purpose of this framework, and what are the capabilities. Then we will talk about the new capabilities added to this framework, which is warehouse app task execution web service, and how this new web service help eliminate some of the limitations we had with the framework. Then we will discuss different performance testing options for warehousing scenarios. We'll show you the demo of warehouse app task validation framework, how to do unit testing and performance testing of specific warehouse processes within Dynamics 365 SCM, as well as how you can do a performance testing using third-party application. In the end, we will share some useful resources and also have some time for Q&A. Let us review and discuss about the warehouse app task validation framework. As many of you are aware, warehouse app task validation framework has been in the system for more than 2 years now. This framework provides capability to record steps of warehouse process such as sales picking or purchase receiving, and once the warehouse process is recorded, it can be executed as part of the regression sort automation tool. This saves a lot of time and effort in regression testing and help automate the testing effort. This framework and process was mainly designed to support RSET. If you look at the diagram, warehouse app task validation framework in Dynamics 365 SCM, where you create specific warehouse tasks, record steps of the warehouse process using warehouse management app. You can then record the task guide of the execution of the warehouse process and store the recording to LCS and DevOps and attach it to a specific test case. You can then sync the test cases to the test plan in RSET. At that stage, you can modify the parameter files and execute the test in RSET. So this way of testing was not intended to perform load or volume testing. Each warehouse task is recorded against a specific user, and we were only able to execute warehouse task for that user. If you needed to execute the warehouse task for like multiple users or multiple warehouse workers, you had to create multiple tasks for that warehouse process for each user. We also did not have ability to run warehouse processes in parallel. We now have a new feature which eliminates these limitations, which we'll review in the next few slides. But let us go back and first show you how the warehouse app task validation framework works in Dynamics 365 SCM. So warehouse app task validation is a form in Dynamics 365 SCM where you can create a new task for specific warehouse process. As you can see, I have few warehouse tasks already created here: sales picking, purchase receiving, cluster picking, etc. So once the new task is created, you can click on the start recording, which will and you can open the warehouse management app to record all the steps in that process. Once the process is complete, you will stop the recording and framework will automatically capture all the steps. Each steps in the recorded are recorded in the form of XML. So if you're aware of the warehouse management app architecture, warehouse management app interacts with the Dynamics 365 SCM in the form of XML using the XML-based custom service. If you would like to understand more, I have provided a link to a previous Tech Talk on this framework, which explains in detail how warehouse mobile app interacts with the Dynamics 365 SCM. But once the task is created and once the steps are recorded, then you can generate the variables and system will automatically define which variables are user set variables and which variables will be set by the system. Then you will be ready to do the unit test by changing the values of the variables, and you will click on the run task button where you can basically test using the run test button. So let us see a demo of how to record a warehouse task using this framework. I will now log in into Dynamics 365 SCM, Warehouse Management Module, Periodic, and Warehouse App Task Validation. So as you can see, I already have some recorded tasks, but let's create a new warehouse task. We will demonstrate a sales picking warehouse process. So I will give a name called sales picking tech talk demo, and then we will associate a warehouse worker with this task. So I will specify a warehouse worker as HN. This is one of the warehouse worker. And now we can basically start recording. Once we click on start recording and say yes, the recording will start. Now we can open the warehouse management app side by side. We will specify the username and password to log in into the warehouse mobile app. Since we are recording the sales picking scenario, we will go into the outbound menu and click on sales picking. For sales picking, the first input we need is the work ID. I have some sample data here which we can utilize. So let's see if we can utilize work order 310. First, let's open the work order 310 and see if it's open. So as you can see that this work order is open, which we can use, which is picking from bulk 001 and putting it into a fulfillment location. So now let's go ahead and specify the work ID as part of the warehouse mobile app so that we can scan the work ID here. Let's specify the work order 310. The next step is to scan the target license plate. So let's copy that from our sample data and let's scan that as part of our sales picking process. Once I scan the license plate, target license plate, the next step in the sales picking process is to put that item into a fulfillment location. So as you can see, item A001 10 quantity will be put into that location using that target license plate. So now we have completed the pick and put step and my work order is closed. So I will stop the recording. As you can see, system automatically capture all the steps. Let's specify some meaningful description here. So we scan the work order in the third, fourth step. Then we basically scan the target license plate. So let's specify scan TLP. And then last step was to put the picked item into the fulfillment location. So now we have recorded all the steps. Next step is to generate variables. So we'll click on generate variables. We'll click yes. And as you can see, item ID, the source license plate, and the location ID are server set, and the target license plate and work ID are the user set variables. So now, once we have recorded steps and generated the variables, we are ready to do the unit test. So for that, let's go back to our sample data. 310 we have already processed when we captured or while we were recording the task. So it is already closed. So let's try to pick up any other work ID. So let's pick up 307. This should be open. So let's copy this and specify as part of the variable step. So we'll specify the work ID as 307 to test this sales pick scenario. And let's also copy the target license plate. So once we have specified the target license plate and work ID to test this scenario, let's also verify that this 307 is open. And after we execute our process, this work order should get closed. So we'll test this sales picking scenario. We have the worker IDs associated. We have updated all the parameters. We'll go into the run task and click on run test. So once we click on run test, it should execute all the steps as part of this sales picking process. If we go into the task history, we'll see the timestamp and we can see all the steps have been executed successfully. Now let's go back and let's verify if this work order 307 is closed. So we'll go into that work order and we can see that pick and put both the steps are closed. Okay, so this is how you can do, you can basically record steps, you can generate variables, and you can do a unit testing by specifying the variables on this form, and it will execute the task for the warehouse worker, which is specified here. But you can also see that this framework had a limitation that it can only be executed only for the warehouse worker specified on the task and the variables value specified in the variable step. And it did not allow us to execute tests in parallel or for bulk transactions. So now let us review the new enhancement made in this framework, which is the warehouse app task execution web service, and understand how it helps eliminate some of the limitations we discussed earlier. Essentially, this new web service is an enhancement to how warehouse process and all the recorded steps for that process will be executed. It eliminates the limitations so that it now supports execution of warehouse tasks for the multiple warehouse workers. You can perform load and volume testing on your warehouse task using bulk transactions. You will also be able to monitor performance, identify any bottlenecks, and that way it provides you the opportunity to optimize the performance. The warehouse task execution is exposed as a web service, which means execution of the warehouse process can be called from any third-party application like .NET application or a performance testing tool such as JMeter. For unit testing, as you can see, you can click on Run Task button, and on Run Task form, we have a new button, Run Test with Parameters, which use this new web service for the execution of the warehouse process. This new web service is available as of 10.0.35. Now let us see step by step how you can use this service for unit testing and more importantly for performance testing. So basic steps I showed earlier remains the same, are to create a new warehouse task and record steps for a specific warehouse process, for example like sales picking process. So once the steps are recorded, you have to generate variables. So here we'll continue to refer the sales picking scenario which we used earlier. Now you are ready to perform the unit test using this new web service. So for that, you will click on the Run Task and you will use the new Run Test with Parameters button. Here you can enter the warehouse process task ID, the warehouse worker or the user ID, and you will specify the values of the user-defined variables which is relevant for that warehouse process. And then you can run the test. So this way you can verify that all the recorded steps for that warehouse process are executing correctly using this new web service. Next, in order to perform the load and volume testing, you need to create bulk data for each warehouse process you would like to test. So for example, sales picking process, you need to create bulk sales orders. You have to release those sales orders to warehouse, which creates a work order with the pick and put steps. You also need to create list of target license plate, which can be used in the put steps for pick goods to put into a license plate controlled fulfillment location. You can then perform load and volume testing within Dynamics 365 by calling the web service for these bulk transactions and at the same time monitor the performance. I will discuss more in detail how you can call this web service within Dynamics 365 in next few slides. Now you can move on to the next step of the performance testing using any third-party application. You can export the bulk data created in Dynamics 365 and export them into Excel or CSV, or maybe you can store them in a third-party application database. Then you can use this data to do the performance testing where you are testing a day in a life scenario or a peak hour warehouse process scenarios. You can configure the performance testing tool first to authenticate against Dynamics 365 SCM and then call the warehouse app task execution web service using bulk transactions where you will essentially passing three parameters: the warehouse task ID, the warehouse worker who will be executing the task, and the user input variables relevant for that warehouse process. Depending on the third-party tool you are using, you will have options to manage and control the load. You can manage the parallelism of the warehouse processes and their execution. While these tests are executing, you can capture the execution time for specific process. For example, like if you are testing a peak hour scenario, you might be processing number of sales order for sales order picking process. You can capture the execution time of the whole load, a specific sales order, or a specific steps in the sales order picking process. Along with this execution time, you can also monitor the CPU utilization, available memory, long-running queries, SQL blockings, etc. from the LCS environment monitoring page. You will also notice few user interface changes with this new web service enhancements. When you click on Run Task button on the Run, it will open the Run Task form and you will see a new button, Run Task with Parameters. This button opens a new dialog where you can specify the warehouse task you want to execute, user or warehouse worker who will execute this warehouse process, and user input variables where you can specify the comma-separated values for these variables. Variable's name must be the same as it is defined in the variables tab of that warehouse task. Another user interface enhancements you will notice is in the View Task History form. On this form, you will see task run will show which warehouse worker executed the task, how much time the task took to execute, and you will notice that the execution time is now captured for each specific step as well. So let us see a demo of the unit testing, how you can do a unit testing using this new web service. So I will go into the Dynamics 365 SCM. Let's start from the beginning, go to the warehouse management module, periodic and warehouse app task validation framework. Let's choose the new task which we created, sales picking tech talk demo. And as you can see, we have already recorded all the steps and all the generated variables. Now we will go into the run task and we will use the run test with parameters button to test using the new web service. So as you can see, the task is automatically selected. You can specify any warehouse worker here. And here we can specify the user input variables. So let's go and pick any user input variables. So this 308 work order is open. So we can take that one and pass as part of our user input variables. So this is the sales picking task. So we only need two variables. One is the work ID. So we'll specify 308 as that is the one which is an open work order. And then we can specify the target license plate. So let's copy the target license plate 3148 and specify as part of our unit testing of the sales picking scenario. So once I have specified the user input variables for worker ID, for target license plate and user ID, I can click OK. And what this will do is this is going to call the web service behind the scene, the new web service, and execute all the steps for the sales picking warehouse process. So we can go to the view task history. As you can see, the HN worker has executed this process. It took 5,000 milliseconds. And you can also see the execution of each steps and how much time it took for each steps. So this is how you can do a testing. We can see that work order 308 is now closed. We have been able to test this work order as part of this using this new web service. So far we have reviewed how to use warehouse app task validation framework, how to create new tasks, how to record steps and generate variables. Then we saw two options to do the unit testing. One option is the old feature where you do unit testing for the warehouse worker defined on that task and the variables value you specified on the variables tab. Then we saw the new option to do the unit testing where you can execute the warehouse process using the new web service, where you have to specify, where you can specify any warehouse worker and you can define your user input variables in the dialog to execute the process. Now, let's move forward and let's review different options for performance testing of a warehouse process using this new web service. There are three different options customer can use depending on the performance testing strategy and the tools they have invested in. The first option is to test the warehouse process for bulk transactions within D365 SCM. The second option is if customer has a third-party application like .NET, which they are leveraging for performance testing, then customer can extend and incorporate this warehouse process performance testing scenario there. Or the third option is, if customer has invested specifically in the performance testing tool, such as JMeter and Azure load testing, then you can use that option as well. So the third option we'll discuss in more detail in the next tech talk. So stay tuned for that one. So before doing any performance testing, it is important to create data set using which you can generate load and volume. We have a basic utility created here, which you can use and extend based on your needs and data. As you can see, for sales picking scenario, I have a form where I create bulk sales orders, release them to warehouse, which creates work orders. And for sales picking warehouse activities, you need work ID and target license plate. So I'm capturing required input details in this table. Similarly, for purchase receiving, you need purchase order, item, and quantity. So I'm creating bulk purchase orders and maintaining this table with all the required data. If you're doing performance testing in Dynamics 365 SCM, you can use these tables and use the required data in your performance testing. I'll show you in the next slide how you can feed this data to call the warehouse app task execution web service. If you're doing performance testing using third-party application like JMeter, you can export data to CSV or Excel file and then feed as an input file to those tools. We'll put this sample X++ code to generate bulk data for sales picking and purchase receiving scenario in GitHub. You can then extend these utilities further based on your scenarios, your data, and requirements. So coming back to the option 1, which is to do performance test within Dynamics 365 SCM. So in this option, you can test the warehouse process for bulk transactions using this warehouse app task execution web service within D365. You will have capabilities to execute warehouse tasks for multiple warehouse workers. You will be able to capture and review execution time for a specific load, specific warehouse transactions, and a specific step. You will still be able to monitor performance of the system in terms of CPU utilization and memory availability. And the screenshot you can see, there is a sample class how to call the web service to execute a specific warehouse process. Let us see a demo of how to call a web service within Dynamics 365 SCM. So I'm now logging into a Visual Studio, and here on the left-hand side, you can see I have a new service called WHS Validator Run Instance Execute Service, has a run instance with parameters method. So let's look at this service. And as you can see, we have a new service class, which is used in this service, WHS Validator Run Instance Execute Service class. If we go and look at the code for this class, we have this method run instance with parameters. This is what is exposed as part of the web service. If you look at the code for this method, it is accepting a parameter called contract, and this is the contract class where we are wrapping the 3 variables: the warehouse task ID, warehouse process task ID, the warehouse worker or the user ID, and all the user input variables which you need to execute that warehouse process. Let's look at the sample code for how to call this web service. So here I have a sample where I'm creating an instance of a service class. I'm creating an instance of a contract class. And this is how I'm wrapping the 3 variables: the warehouse process task ID, the user ID, and since this is a sales pick scenario, you can see the work ID and the target license plate. And then I'm calling the service using this run instance with parameters method. And again, you can use this sample data and feed that into your web service call, and you can execute that warehouse process. So every time you execute this process in that particular warehouse task history job, you will see an execution for each execution, and you will be able to see the execution time for each transaction, as well as you will be able to see the execution time for all the steps it has recorded. You can also take this sample code and extend it. So you can basically create a run-based class to execute the warehouse specific warehouse processes. So like if you're doing a performance testing for a peak hour scenario, you can execute one job for sales picking scenario for let's say 500 sales order. Then you can loop through all the sample data or the bulk data which you have created. You can utilize the open work IDs and target license plate from that table, which I showed you earlier. And that at the same time, if you are also planning to test the purchase receiving scenario, you can execute another job for let's say 400 purchase order, loop through all the purchase order, read the purchase order number, item, and quantity. And using those values, you can call this web service. You can just feed that data, the bulk data which you have generated, and you can call this service. And you will be able to basically go into D365 and we'll be able to see the job history or the run history, and you will be able to see each execution which you are processing. So and you can do this in parallel as well. So you can try to execute this task in parallel to mimic the real world scenarios. So we will share this sample X++ code in GitHub, which you can use as a starting point. And then you can extend it as per your needs and your scenarios. So second option is to do the performance testing using third-party app and execute the same warehouse processes. So in this option, you can test the warehouse processes for the bulk transactions by calling this warehouse app task execution web service from third-party application. In this case, I'm just taking an example of .NET application, but this is a web service, so you can call it from any third-party app. You will still have capabilities to execute warehouse tasks across multiple warehouse workers. You will be able to capture and review the execution time for specific load, specific transaction, or specific step. If you have a backend database in your third-party app, you can even store the response and execution time there. You can still monitor the performance of the system in terms of CPU utilization and memory availability. The only thing which you need to keep in mind while doing the performance testing using this approach is that the third-party application calling the warehouse app tasks execution web service request can be throttled based on the number of requests you are processing. So for example, if you are processing more than 6,000 requests in 5 minutes, then the request might be throttled and you will be presented with the 429 response. So you need to handle these responses, 429 responses, using the retry option so that your request will be processed accordingly. So let us see a demo of how to call a web service from the third-party application. So I will now log in into the Visual Studio. This is a sample C# program. And as you can see, I'm first specifying the warehouse task ID. Again, I'm taking an example of sales picking scenario here. So this is a task ID for the sales picking scenario. Then I'm using the application ID and application secret to authenticate against Dynamics365 SCM. Once it generates a token, I can then call the service WHS validator run instance service, and I will call this run instance with parameters method. As you can see, this method accepts the one parameter contract, and as part of this contract, I'm wrapping the warehouse task ID, the warehouse worker, and since this is a sales picking scenario, I'm specifying worker ID and the target license plate. And then I will post the URL. So let's execute this program and see what is the request and what is the response. So as you can see, the request is basically a contract. Then it is doing a post to that Dynamics365 SCM service. And then as you can see the response, we can see each steps and that execution. So step 1 is actually taking 524 milliseconds. Step 2 is taking 206 milliseconds. So this response you get, you can also verify the execution time from Dynamics365 SCM. So let's go back to our warehouse app task validation form, main form. And from there, we can look at the view task history. And as you can see, this is what we executed from the third-party app. You can see the process took 3,900 milliseconds. The first step took 524 milliseconds. The second step took 206 milliseconds. Right? So That's how you basically call a web service, Dynamics 365 web service, to execute a specific warehouse process from .NET application. Now, as you know, we have the sample data as well, which you can create, a bulk transaction in Dynamics 365 SCM. This you can export in Excel and CSV file, and then in your .NET program, you can basically read from this Excel or CSV file, and that way you can process bulk of transactions by calling this warehouse app task execution web service. And you can basically run multiple scenarios in parallel by running this process in parallel. So you might be testing sales picking scenario at the same time. You might be testing purchase receiving scenario or any other scenario which is relevant in your organization. And that way you can generate the load, you can call the web service, it will execute the warehouse processes, so that you will be able to measure the performance of the system, as well as you will be able to record the execution time for each warehouse load you are generating. Again, we'll put this sample code into GitHub, and then you can kind of take it as a starting point and tweak it as per your scenarios. And the third option to do the performance test of the warehouse process is utilizing the performance testing tool like JMeter and this warehouse app task execution web service. So this, we have parked it for a next tech talk, because JMeter in itself is a big topic, and we would need full hour to kind of show you end-to-end process. So we have planned this tech talk on November 2nd. So if you haven't already registered, please go ahead and register for this tech talk. So finally, to wrap up things, few things to keep in mind: that this framework enables scenarios to execute warehouse processes in parallel for bulk transactions and for multiple warehouse workers. This framework helps detect any performance issues in specific warehouse process execution. However, it is not intended to do integration with third-party WMS systems, and it is also not intended to measure the mobile device health or network latency. We also have another feature in the system called warehousing telemetry. If you enable this feature, system starts emitting the telemetry data for the various warehouse activities. This telemetry data also helps you understand the general health of your tenants and devices, so that you can analyze these operations which affect the performance. Also, to keep in mind, all the telemetry data is exposed into your own application insights. So, application insight is not available in all geography. For example, it's not available in the Mooncake geography or the China region. So I have provided a link to the docs article for more details about this feature and how you can enable it, and GitHub site where we have a sample Power BI report which you can use to view the telemetry data. So that is all I wanted to cover as part of this tech talk. Let us review some of the useful resources. So the first link is about the previous tech talk which we did on the warehouse app task validation framework, which gives you a good understanding of the framework. We have a docs article for that warehouse app task validation framework. We have a docs article for the RSET tool to do the regression testing and automate the testing. We recently published a documentation on how to use JMeter for Dynamics 365 finance and operations. So we have published a couple of articles already, and we are working on publishing the rest in coming weeks. Here you can also see the link for the GitHub site where we have put the sample code, how to call the web service from D365, the sample utility to generate bulk data, and also the sample C# code, which gives you an understanding of how to call a web service from a third-party application. And then we have listed a couple of Yammer groups, which you can join if you have not already joined, related to the warehouse management app and the regression shoot automation tool. So we do encourage you to utilize these resources and try this new web service to test your warehousing scenario, or if you have a requirement of testing warehouse processes as part of your performance testing. With that, I'll now open it up for the questions. Ajay, do we have any questions in the chat?
There was just one question which I answered, so there is no more question right now.
So we'll wrap it up. I'll hand it over to Alejandra for closing.
Thank you, Hiren. I posted a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session and what would you like to see in future events. Thanks to our presenters and to you, our audience, for attending to our Tech Talk today. We hope you have a great rest of the day.